Well, it's really wonderful to meet you today. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. I know I come at you out of the blue. You don't know who the heck I am, and it's great that you were willing to talk to me. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. I'm going to enjoy it.
So maybe we start off just by talking about where you live and what you do these days.
Okay. So my wife and I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. I've been in Raleigh since 1990. Um, what I do these days is really pretty simple. Both my wife and I are retired. Been retired for almost 7 years.
Oh, wow.
And really enjoying that. Spending a lot of time with grandchildren. We have 6 grandchildren. That keeps us busy.
I know how that is. Yeah.
And we're lucky enough that many of them are close by. Some are not, so we have to deal with that. But it's really, in fact, one is up the block, so that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that makes it nice. I've only been retired for about a year now, so I'm still adjusting to that lifestyle. But
It's a lot of work to not work.
yeah, it takes a while to adjust to that. It really does, especially when you've been working. I know I was working 43 years. You probably worked for something along those lines as well.
Yeah, about 48, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with vintage computers.
Oh, wow. So not even much prior to Exidy. Um, when I went to high school, I went to a high school that was associated with Notre Dame University. It was called Notre Dame High School, cleverly enough. This was in LA. And we were all taught by the same order of brothers as Notre Dame University. A brother is basically like a male nun. And my freshman algebra teacher was an amateur computer guy. Now, to put this in context, this is 1969, well into the era of mainframes and nothing but.
Right.
So for him to be a brother and B, you do computers as a hobby, he got access to some large systems with very large mainframes as a kind of a donation. So he approached me one day. I'm a freshman. I'm 14, I think. And he says, do you want to learn a little bit about computers? And I said, yeah. So he gave me a Fortran book for the language called Fortran. And I was hooked. He was able to get an IBM 1620, which is a first generation IBM computer, again, in the era of building size mainframes. This computer actually fit in a room. He got it donated to the school, and we ended up putting it in the classroom where we learned algebra. And we had a key punch and a punch card reader and a punch card punch. This is ancient, okay? I mean, ancient.
I know some of that stuff, so I know what you're talking about.
And I got started programming. I programmed my first Fortran program, and we ran it through this machine. And it took weeks to debug it because I didn't know what the heck I was doing. But when I got it to work, it was such a thrill to finally get mastery over this beast that I was hooked. And that was 48 years, beginning of the career. And I'm still hooked. I mean, even retired, I still tinker and play. So that man set me on a path that I never looked back. So that's how I began.
So I'm familiar with Fortran. I've got an engineering degree. So, Fortran was the language of choice for engineers, obviously.
It was.
So, yeah, I'm definitely familiar with that. So what about personal computers, home computers? When did you first get involved with anything
Yeah,
along those lines.
yeah, that was quite a transition. I did my undergraduate work at UCLA, and they had the biggest, fastest IBM mainframe in the country at the time. It's called a 36091. Again, building size, multiple floors, multiple rooms. And I, as a freshman there, finagled a job in the systems programming team for that mainframe. There was one mainframe that ran the whole campus, everything. All 33,000 students, all the researchers, all the professors, transcripts, everything. And by a whole lot of luck and being in the right place at the right time, I was able to get a position on that team as a trainee, a coder trainee. And that's because I only knew Fortran. And they did all their work in 360, 370 assembly language. And that was simply because that team was the beta site for IBM's mainframe operating system. So they would give us the source, IBM would give us the source of their operating system, the entire thing. And if we found a bug, we would go in and find the bug in the code, fix the bug, this is all assembly language, test it, and then send IBM the patch. They would then integrate the patch into their next rev of the operating system and ship it out to the world. So what a way to learn. I was surrounded by geniuses, and it was all at the assembly level, which is about as low level as you could practically get. And I was surrounded by people that just did this with both hands tied behind their back. So it was a great training ground and proving ground. I was also at UCLA the year after the first internet traffic was sent. The internet back then was called the ARPANET or DARPANET, and there were 3 IP addresses: UCLA, Stanford, and the DARPA lab. And one of the professors at UCLA was the one who invented IP, literally the protocol we use today. So I was, again, surrounded by geniuses who were there at the very beginning, the first login over the internet, what is now the internet. So
So what was his name?
Kleinrock, Dr. Leonard Kleinrock.
Okay.
He wrote IP as his master thesis, if you can imagine the impact of and how forward thinking he was. So I was surrounded by people that were writing the first FTP, the first Telnet. I mean, very, very much at the beginning of networking of computers, because that was in IBM's mind. There was no networking. So I worked there for I guess let's see, about 9 years, and came to the conclusion that mainframes were fascinating, but not where the world was going. I decided that the world was going in the area of personal computers, not multi-million-dollar ones, and ones that you could actually have on your desk. So I bought this this crazy desktop thingy called the Sorcerer from this company I'd almost never heard of. Remember, I'm still in LA.
Mm-hmm.
And I started looking at the Sorcerer deeply. And of course, being familiar with diving into the guts of any computer I was using, I decided to look at how it works on the inside. So I took it apart, I looked at the circuit board, but I was more interested in what they called a monitor, which was the I guess what would be on a normal PC, the BIOS today. And I wrote a disassembler in BASIC on the Sorcerer to turn the monitor back into assembly language from the machine code that was in the ROM. And then I figured out how the monitor worked, instruction by instruction. And I was fascinated by that. But this was all hacked by then. So I decided, if it's interesting for me, it might be interesting for others. So I wrote a book, meaning I got on a typewriter, literally, and typed a manual called the Sorcerer Internals Guide that I ultimately later published with Quality Software. And this gave all the tricks and ins and outs and places to poke and what all the memory structures were of the monitor. So I started selling this thing through Byte Shops, BYTE, which is where they were kind of like the Radio Shack of early computer.
Right, and is that where you met Paul Terrell? Well, I assume that's where you met Paul Terrell.
Well, yes and no. What happened was I just kept selling and writing games and plotting software, and one of these manuals ended up on Paul Terrell's desk up in Sunnyvale, where Exidy's headquarters was. So he said, what the heck? It actually created quite a stir because they kind of thought that there had been a leak in all the proprietary information about how all this was put together. Because there were things in there that were not public knowledge. But if you disassemble the code and reverse engineer everything and you stare at it long enough, you can figure it out. So I got a phone call, and it started, it was friendly, but it started with kind of like, who have you been talking to and why do you know this? And after a while, we got all that straight, and he said, let's fly you up to Sunnyvale. We'd like to talk. And I'm still at UCLA as a senior systems programmer on the mainframe. So that we fly up there, and I was taken. I met, of course, Hal Ivey and Paul and the basic E team. And we talked about what they were up to. And I decided, kind of scary, in fact, looking back, I'm amazed I did it. I decided to kind of give up a job that had probably security until I die, working for UCLA, and take a chance with a startup company that worked on microcomputers of all things and video games. Holy cow. So I did. My family got packed up, and my wife and I, my ex-wife and I, now ex-wife, moved up to Sunnyvale and started work at Exidy. Interestingly, the second day I was there, I got a call from my, again, now ex, saying that she's pregnant. And she was pregnant with our daughter, our first child. So life really took a turn.
Some changes.
Exidy.
Yeah.
So they hired me as vice president of software development. So I was in charge of all software for the company, which meant both divisions. So my team was a pretty diverse and very flexible set of programmers and designers. They worked simultaneously on the Sorcerer, which was the main product of the Data Products division, and on the video games, the cabinet-based, arcade-based video games, which were part of the games division. And obviously those are very different.
Yeah.
But they're all microcomputers. The Sorcerer was Z80 based. The games started off 6502 based, which was the beginnings of the Apple II at the very same time. Eventually migrated to more advanced microcomputer chips, which we could talk about if you like. So this was a pretty interesting group of folks, some of which I hired as one of my first duties, some of which I inherited. They were already there doing work. And Howell Ivy was, of course, a co-founder, but he was VP of hardware design. So he and I were kind of like two sides of the same coin. We would work together, which was just a fabulous relationship. Hal's a super smart guy, always has been. I saw the interview. He still is, obviously. So he was the hardware guy. I was the software guy. We knew enough about the other's discipline just to be able to talk and be a little dangerous, but we knew who was the expert, right? Howell was the expert. So we worked together, modifying and designing new hardware boards, especially for the games, and also creating more advanced software to run both in the Sorcerer and on the games. The same team of programmers did both.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So did you have different people who focused, like on one platform versus the other, or did everybody work on everything?
There were definitely leanings, but everybody worked on everything because it was small. There were only like 4 of us, not including me. I was on my own staff. I assigned my own projects to me because we didn't have enough people for me to just be a manager. I was hands-on and did stuff too, but it was a small group, and there really never was the budget to go crazy and start hiring different call them subdivisions within the programming group. So one of the job description requirements was to be able to be multidisciplinary and multi-architecture.
Yeah.
And only assembly language, because there was no choice. You couldn't. The only other major programming languages of the time was BASIC, which the Sorcerer had in a ROM pack as an interpreter. So it ran quite slowly, not good for a video game. And Fortran, which didn't really lend itself to video games either. So I began work, and one of the first things that became clear, and one of my mandates was, when I came on board, the Sorcerer was cassette-based. Besides the ROM packs, if you wanted to save anything, you would save it to an audio cassette player, standard,
right,
off the shelf. And the world was heading towards floppy. So Howell, again, a hardware genius, figured out a way to get an S100 bus, an expansion bus that connected to the back of the Sorcerer, to have a floppy disk interface in there. And we made a deal with Micropolis to have a two floppy high stack of 512K floppies, which at the time was unbelievably dense.
Yeah.
Everybody was used to the big 8-inch 128Ks that IBM invented. These were 5¼ inch 512K. Oh my gosh, 4 times the size. So, but we needed an operating system, because you can't just treat the floppy as this big amorphous storage device. So I looked around, and there were several contenders for what would be the best one, but the one that percolated at the top was called CPM. There was a company in Pacific Grove, California, which is about, 30 miles south near Monterey. And so I went down there and started conversations with their executive team, and we formed a license deal. Again, everything was get the source, because we didn't know if off the shelf would work. In fact, there wasn't much off the shelf. There were no standards. This is the beginning before there were really industry standards. So,
was that Digital Research that you were talking to?
correct. That's exactly
Okay.
right. Yes, and the CPM turned out to be an awesome little miniature OS, and we got it to work with the S100 interface and the Micropolis floppy drives, and we were able to test the heck out of it and have a real file system with folders, what we now call folders, and file names, and the ability to save things and reload them easily. Nowhere near what Linux has today or Windows has today with the file systems, but a huge leap from cassette based. So we started shipping that, and that was a big hit, because the idea was the Sorcerer was a business computer, not a toy. And to be that, you really needed a storage device, a mass storage device.
Did you get a chance to meet Gary Kildall then as part of all of this when you were talking with
briefly.
Okay.
No, not much interaction. No.
Okay.
Then it became clear, okay, what about apps? I mean, today we look at product and platform and we say, yeah, but what apps? Well, back then it was clear even then. So we really didn't have apps. We had some ROM packs. There was a basic interpreter. There was a word processor. This is 40 years ago. I'm trying to remember, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
But that needed disk-based applications that were, again, business-oriented, serious. So there was this crazy company up in Redmond called Microsoft. They were a tiny little company at the time, and they were the ones who provided the basic interpreter that ended up in the ROM pack. So I called them up, and I have no idea who I spoke to then, but started negotiations for a basic compiler, because then it would actually run at machine speed. The code that you wrote would run at machine speed. So I got the basic compiler. I also got a Fortran compiler, which they were offering, and believe it or not, a COBOL compiler. Again, business computer, right? So the license deal I made with them was to get full distribution rights, but also full access to the source. Again, because things just didn't run out of the box. So I got all that, we signed it all up, and I started integrating all of these fairly substantial applications for that day and age onto this little 8-bit computer called the Z80, and got it to work. And interestingly, quick aside, I found bugs. Microsoft had bugs. Is that a surprise? I don't know.
No, that's not a surprise.
I didn't think so. So I had the source, and I was used to finding bugs in somebody else's code, because that's what I did for 9 years with IBM's code at the assembly level. So I found the bugs, I patched the bugs, retested, rebuilt and tested, and the bugs went away. So I kept throwing bug fixes over the wall to my counterpart over at Microsoft. And after about 6 months of this, I finally got it stable. And after about 6 months of this, I got a call, hey, would you like a job in the programming department? And I said no, because at the time it was like, well, who the heck are they? I'm already working for a company.
Right.
So Yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious, was this stuff that you got from them, was it all targeting the Z80 processor, or was it actually
No, they
for?
wrote it for 8080.
Okay,
Z80 was kind of a lunatic fringe. It was faster than an 8080. Uh, it supported all the instructions of an 8080, but it also added some opcodes and
right.
some registers, some index registers, which made it a lot more powerful to write real code. Again, this is before any follow-on to the 8080 came out. So it worked. The fact that it was written for 8080 means it just worked. But I had to integrate it in CPM. I had to, all of that rigmarole.
Sure.
And then I had to package it so that we could turn around and sell it. So we did. We made a product, a Fortran compiler on a floppy, same with the COBOL, same with BASIC, and we started selling it along with the Sorcerer going forward, and along with CPM. I mean, somebody could still buy a cassette-based one if they were, on a budget or didn't have serious business needs.
About what time frame was this when you had all this work done and you started to sell this, this productivity software?
80-ish, early 80, 81.
Okay.
Now, simultaneously, we're doing the games too. So we were busy.
Yeah, I imagine you were. I guess as far as so you took all this stuff from Microsoft and you not only converted it to work with the Z80 and with CPM, but you also had to improve it and make it something that you could actually sell in the marketplace.
I wouldn't go too far with the improve verb. The improve was fixing some bugs, but it was really more packaging a product so that somebody could actually run a compile that bought it from us. So it needed to be packaged and then documented in such a way to give them instructions on how a customer of Exidy would use this product for their own purposes. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Did you actually start using any of that software then in any further software development that you guys did? Because now you have better tools, right?
No, not, well, yes and no. The Fortran and COBOL were not usable in either one of our divisions in our environment. The basic compiler I did use because in order to get a lot of the code written, believe it or not, for the games, I would write algorithms in BASIC and compile them, run them on the Sorcerer so that I could get the results, or it could be a test, or it could actually be generating a table or a database for the game. So I used it as a tool, but it never actually, compiled code never actually ended up in any game, simply because it was too clunky. The games are handwritten in assembly language, line by line, the hard way.
To be most efficient.
Correct.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
If you'd like, I could give you an example of using that technique to use the product as the workstation on the data product side to generate what was necessary on the game side. There was a game called Vertigo, which was the only game at the time that was in a cabinet that you crawl into. Remember, this is all arcade, not home. You actually crawl into like a cockpit, and it's a spaceship, but you fly it like a plane. Because at the time, both Hal and I were pilots, so we had to do something. So this cockpit moved. So as you pitched up in the game on the screen, the cabinet pitched up. As you rolled starboard and port, the cabinet would roll. And so you've got the 3D feel along with what was going on the screen. This screen was also 3D. It wasn't a two-dimensional raster. It was a 3D vector-based display. So all the critters and the space you were flying in was full 3D. So that meant a lot of mathematical operations going on with a lot of trig, sines and cosines and tangents, a lot of multiplication and division, real 3D to do the transformation. An 8-bit computer has no such capability. It doesn't even have multiply. It barely has add. So the only way to do multiply and trig was to generate tables in advance and store them in the EEPROM or the ROM of the game and do table lookups to do a multiply. And it was done using logarithms. So if you convert everything to logarithms, then a multiply becomes an add, which the 8-bit processor is good at. And the same with trig. I mean, you could take the sign of anything with looking it up in a table. So the basic program was written on the Sorcerer to generate a highly defined and resolute table of logarithms, anti-logarithms to reverse the process, sines and cosines, so that the little 8-bit processors could actually do what is now called computer graphics. Back then, there was no such thing. So there was a marriage. There was a marriage of the two. And it really was challenging and a lot of fun, very satisfying.
I'll bet it was. I mean, you guys were kind of treading new ground there and having to figure it all out as you went.
Very much. And Howell was the one who created these hardware systems for the games, along with the Sorcerer, of course. He designed the Sorcerer motherboard. So we ended up having multi-processor games. That Vertigo game that I was telling you about, the main brain was a 68,000, which had just been released, and it was 16-bit. Holy cow. And it was actually much faster. It also had a 6809, which is a Motorola chip, to run the cabinet motion, the motors that move the cabinet, and a 6809 to do all the audio, because we ended up doing not just boops and beeps and bells, which was the classic old style audio, but actual recordings. So we would have airplane noises and people screaming and, real audio recorded, digitized, saved in the game. Then the 6809, using hardware that Howell designed, would play it back through the speakers. So it's very realistic and none of the kind of old style beeps and boops that we were used to in prior games. I think there were at least 4 microprocessors all interoperating. And then the last one was to help with the graphics. Howell designed a bit slice processor where the instructions were about 100 bits wide. It's not 16, not 32, but 100.
Wow.
Custom made where each bit controlled a piece of hardware, also custom created and designed by Howell. And then I wrote the compiler to generate those 100-bit instructions, just so that it did exactly what we needed it to do for the graphics and no more. So again, that marriage between Howell's genius in hardware and the software work really played a factor.
Yeah, well, you really did challenge your developers. They had to be able to write for a lot of different
Exactly.
processors there.
That's
Amazing.
right. And they did it. These were smart guys. They worked hard.
So by this time, was all of your development on was it all around disk-based software rather than ROM packs, or were you still developing ROM packs as well?
There were no ROM packs developed from the time I got there. The suite was set because once you started doing floppy based, it was hard going back.
Yeah. Okay.
In fact, after a while, floppy started to be a bit clunky, and there was this rumor there were these things called hard disk drives. So I searched around, and there was this company. For the life of me, I don't remember the name of the company, but they had a 10 meg hard drive. It was about this big. The platter was about this big, which today is preposterous. I mean, you could get hundreds of terabytes on a disk, but 10 meg, and it came with an S100 interface. Oh my gosh. So the only challenge was to get one of these prototypes and then integrate it with CPM so that CPM would know what to do with it, because it's not a floppy and it's not, 1 meg or 512K, it's 10 meg. It changes all the scaling of everything. But we got it to work. We got 2 of them because these were rare, and we created a product. And we put it on the price list, but it was so pricey, I think it was beyond the budget of people with small business computers, so we never actually sold one. But we used it internally.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it was probably quite a bit more than the cost of the system itself, I would imagine, at that time.
Yes.
So who wrote the manuals for this stuff? Did you have people dedicated to writing manuals? It sounded like you had a small team, or how did the manuals get written?
So the ones from Microsoft came with a form of a user's manual, the compilers. We got the rights to the source of those, so we were able to add and make adjustments for our environment. For the products that we created, we had a tech writer, part of the, if I remember correctly, the marketing and sales team. I think he reported to Paul. He didn't report to me. And it was the right approach, because a good tech writer is not on the development team. They're more user focused, not geek focused. Then you end up with a good manual. So we would sit down with them and we would kind of be interviewed, and then they would write a manual, and then we would come in and make adjustments and interact and make it work. In some cases, I wrote a manual because I was responsible for that also. So one way or the other, we knew that it was important to get these manuals done along with the product and not just throw the floppy over the wall.
So when did John Borders come into the picture?
John preceded me. So he's the one who wrote the monitor, the original BIOS, if I can use that modern term. And when I got there, I have to tell you, it's a little vague. I don't remember working with him. I think he was already gone, or he was in the process of departing.
Okay.
He certainly wasn't on my team. He wasn't one of my developers. I don't remember much interaction. That doesn't mean that he wasn't critical, but I just Ships passed in the night, I think.
Okay, very good. So at some point, the data products division got sold off. You were still there, is that right? And that happened?
Yes. Yes.
So what was that like, and what was the ongoing perception at the time?
Well, let me answer it two ways. One, on a more personal level, I had come from a rock solid, never to go away job working for UCLA and went to work for a startup. And I'm still a young whippersnapper, so I don't know what that means really. Well, this is the first wake up call about what that means because business requirements came to the point where the data products division just was not holding its own as part of the Exidy global piece. So the decision was made. And of course, it's all about budget and making payroll and keeping things profitable like any business. So the decision was made. And that was my first exposure to, wait a minute, you mean that piece of my job is gone? Now, the good news is I still had the games division, which went on until I finally left the company. But it was unnerving, personally to me, to think, wait a minute, you mean that's not under my control? Up to that point, if I do a really good job, then I'm good. I'm employed and I'm happy. But that doesn't work in the real world. So that was strange. On the more practical side, um, we had tried a lot of different things to get that Sorcerer launched. And I think Howell, when he talked about it in your interview with him, I think he nailed it when he said the choice was made not to go out and get some VC. So it was all self-funded, and you needed that boost, that kickstart to get the marketing and the exposure out there because it was the most powerful PC for a business on the market. Apple cleaned our clocks, but they weren't business oriented. It was more of a toy. So on a business level, we had the right product, but no, we were a very well kept secret. And so it never really took off. So we tried everything. We tried making deals with foreign countries. We created a Thai, as in Thailand, Sorcerer, where used the programmable character sets to actually have non-Roman, non-English monitor. We did a Vietnamese one, we did a Japanese one, but it's just never got traction. So it was time to divest ourselves. So they sold it off to another company, and the team stayed with me. We stayed with the games division, and that company took over sales, marketing, and any further development.
So you really had no interaction with them beyond that point. Once it got sold, that was the end of the line.
There was, of course, transition, right?
Yeah.
We wanted our baby to survive the move, so we helped them. But basically, they owned the whole thing, and we severed the cord at some point.
Okay. So a number of people left around the 1987 time frame. Is that when you left?
Yes. Yes.
I guess I'm not. So where did you go from there?
When I left Exidy, because of my work in graphics, even though they were video games, so it was for play, I caught the attention of a director at Sun Microsystems, which was also in Mountain View, Sunnyvale. This is around the time that Silicon Valley actually became the acronym Silicon Valley. When I started at Exidy, it was just another little Bay Area town. So by that time, Sun Microsystems was well established as one of the top 3 workstation providers on Earth. One was IBM and one was Sun Microsystems. And so they had a complete division for graphics, imaging, and video. And so they suggested I check it out and we do some interviewing and see if there's a match. And there was. So I ended up working for Sun as managing one of the video teams and imaging teams, and stayed there for about 7 years.
Quite a while. Okay. So you mentioned before a company called Quality Software.
Yeah.
Where did that come into this picture? Because I haven't heard anything about Quality Software and when you were a part of that.
Quality Software was I'll call them a third party whose products were either documentation in the form of books or product, software product. So they got involved with me specifically around the Sorcerer internals manual that I had written on a typewriter on 8.5 by 11 paper that I sold in a baggie. They said, we see a market for this. How about if we actually rebrand it and republish it as an actual book, bound and so forth, instead of on an old typewriter. And so they did, and they sold quite a few copies, because even though there was by then Sorcerer was disc-based and so on, there were still people who wanted to know the secrets under the covers, when you lifted the hood. And so they sold quite a few of those manuals, and then I ended up getting royalties, because it was always my book. It was never Exidy's book. And Paul was fine with that. Anything to get the word out for Sorcerer was a good thing. And then some of the software that was written either by me early before I worked at Exidy, like I wrote a plotter, get the T's right, so that you give it a function and some data and it would draw the graph on the screen using the programmable character set. Took one of the Exidy games, which was called Spectar, in the arcade, and put it on the Sorcerer again with the programmable character set. I sold those before Exidy ever hired me. So they turned around and repackaged them, got them off cassette tape where they were, and put them on floppy, packaged them, wrote little manuals, and sold them too. So that's basically what they did in general. My office mate back at UCLA, my mentor at the time and one of the best programmers I've ever known in my life, he stayed at UCLA, ended up retiring as a vice chancellor, running the entire division that he worked in. So he did very well. He went in the Apple direction, while I went in the Sorcerer direction. So he used Quality Software to sell some of the video games that he wrote for the Apple II. So we were both dabbling, and Quality Software is a great vehicle for that.
I see. So you were involved with quality software while you were at UCLA and while you were at Exidy.
Exactly.
And okay, gotcha. That makes sense. So I guess I'm curious, do you stay in touch with any of the people that you worked with back then?
I did for a while. Larry Hutcherson was on my team, and we would talk to each other once in a while. But to be honest, especially now that I'm retired, I've lost touch. I frankly wouldn't even know how to reach anybody anymore. We've just gone our separate ways. And that's a sad commentary because we were quite a team and tight, but not anymore.
But what was it like working with, Hal Ivey and Paul Terrell? I mean, was that what was that like?
Um, as I've said more than once, and I'll be happy to say it again, Howell was a genius. He forgot more about hardware design than most hardware engineers know, and he was very creative. He was also a nice guy. I mean, just really nice to work with. So when he and I would sit down with an idea, either from my head or more often from his head, on a new capability, a new game design, a new feature for the Sorcerer, whatever, we would sit down together and we were both like peas in a pod. It just clicked. He relied on me to get him up the software learning curve. And I learned more about hardware design from him than I've learned from anybody. I mean, this is the era, keep in mind, this is the era of little dual inline packages and TTL and big, maybe a few layer circuit boards. This is not, custom chips and, there were no custom anything. So that came much later. So he had to do it the hard way and cheaply so that it didn't break the bank to build the thing. So we had great times. And he taught me a little bit about hardware design, so I ended up being able to design some simple S100 boards and just, again, to tinker. And he ended up writing a little bit of software. I think the rising tide floats all boats, so we both benefited. And I'll never forget that time with him. He was wonderful.
Did you have much interaction with Paul, I guess, while you were there?
Yeah. He was in charge of doing the sales of everything, of course, the games and the Sorcerer. I don't remember the exact timing, but I think he left before I did. I could be wrong.
Yeah, I don't recall when he actually left from the interview I had with him.
Yeah, Paul was great, and I owe him that job because he's the one who saw the connection between my old life and the Exidy life. And Exidy was the stepping stone to the rest of my career.
Sure.
Because Sun got me into other global and enterprise class companies where I was able to run much larger teams with much bigger products and ended up CTO in one of these large global companies. So Paul was kind of the instigator.
So do you have any Sorcerer or any Sorcerer stuff today or anything that you had from when you worked back at Exidy?
No.
No.
I kept my Sorcerer around for ages, like decades.
Uh-huh.
Then it was time to move, and it was just hard to justify. I mean, it still worked, for crying out loud.
Oh yeah.
No,
You probably had all the expansions as well, I would
Oh yeah.
assume,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, by then PCs had become so capable and so powerful that the Sorcerer just became a kind of a museum piece in my house. And if I had thought it through, I would have kept it and
You,
just.
you didn't like throw it away or anything, did you?
No, I sold it. And
Okay.
no, I wanted to make sure it got a good home. Oh heck. Yeah, I even had
Uh,
a video game cabinet in my house for a while,
oh yeah.
and ended up having to sell that too because it's just that's a big sucker.
Yeah, those take up a lot of room, I'm sure. Well, I think I've pretty much come to the end of questions that I wanted to ask. Are there any questions I should have asked or that you wanted to talk about that I didn't mention?
No, actually, I think you really covered it nicely. Um, the closing comment I would make is I always will have and had a bit of a sad memory that it didn't take off.
Mm,
Um, it wasn't the first startup that I worked for that didn't go public and become a success. There were two more after that. So it kind of prepared me for the shock of no matter, even if you're doing a great job, the doors close and you're out of work.
things happen that are outside your control, right?
Exactly. Exactly right. And that was that brutal awakening that I already talked about. But I will always feel sad because in my heart of hearts, I would always think we had either the best business desktop computer. I can't really call it a PC because that connotes something else, or one of the best. Because I knew all the competition out there, and the fact that no one really knows too much about it these days, other than folks like you and others, it's sad because it shouldn't have gotten more, it should have gotten more recognition than it did. It deserved it. And that doesn't even go into the fact that there were teams of people, both my team, the hardware team with its engineers working for Howell, a whole factory full of people assembling and testing the various gadgets, working their tails off, and it just now is a distant memory. What are you going to do?
Yeah, I mean, it is because it was a very early machine. I mean, it came out just after what we call the Trinity, right? The Apple II and TRS-80 Model 1 and Commodore PET. I mean, it came out shortly thereafter. So it was really early. It came out before some of the machines that are remembered, a little more, maybe like the VIC 20 or the Commodore 64. But it was a pretty nice machine. I owned one for a while, um, but I didn't end up keeping it. But I thought it was a really nice machine, and it for the time and for the power that it had, it's pretty nice.
Yeah, it was the only one with a Z80, so it was faster.
Right,
It had
right.
more RAM. Its screen was had more resolution. It had the expansion bus that was essentially infinite for all intents and purposes. Very high-end floppies for the time, not cassette. Even for the Apple II, it blew away the storage capabilities of the Apple II. Did not have color, but that wasn't its job. Its job was not to be fun, it was to be business. It had compilers, it was ready for programming. It might have been too early, actually, given the state of affairs for home computers. Might have been too early, and no one really understood what that power meant.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
it was a well-kept secret.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. And they're not easy to acquire today. They're not, you don't find many of them available, and you got to
Really?
pay big bucks. So,
Really?
yeah.
Have you seen them avail?
Yeah, I mean, there's always one or two on eBay, but they're going to cost you $1,000 to $1,500,
Oh my
to pick one
gosh.
up, just for the computer, not, none of the accessories.
Right.
All those are each going to cost you quite a bit.
Oh
So,
my
yeah,
God.
they're rare, definitely rare.
Huh.
Okay, well, is there anything else that you want to say before we parted here?
No, I really appreciate your questions, Randy, and I enjoyed the ability to bring some of these memories back. That was a lot of fun.
Great, great. I love to hear that. A lot of people tell me that, and I'm glad when, and a lot of people tell me, it was so long ago, I can't even remember, some of the details, but, that's okay. Whatever you remember is great, more than we have.
Well, the thing I
So,
remember most is this was so early on into what is now a field that just everybody takes for granted without even thinking. Like you flip the switch and the light comes on. Back then, there was no switch, there was no light, there was no nothing, and everything was by hand. So I feel so blessed that I was there at the very beginning of the internet, the beginning of personal computers, and I was surrounded by people who were willing to teach me and put up with my lack of understanding until I finally got it. And I will always feel, counter to the regret that I mentioned earlier, I will always feel that little warm spot right here that I was there when. That's fun.
and you should be proud of that, because it sounds like you did some great work. So that's a terrific ending. I appreciate that.
Thanks,
And it
Rick.
was great meeting with you. If I
Yeah.
can facilitate in any way you getting back together with with Howell or with Paul, let me know. I'm in contact with both of them. But uh, again, I appreciate your time.
Well, definitely if you talk to him again, say hello. I know how to reach Howell.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, I'd be curious to see how he's doing for sure. Can you send me a link to this podcast?
Yes, I'm sorry. That was the other thing I was going to mention. When this gets published, I'll let you know and I'll send you a link to it so
Perfect.
you can listen and or watch. And I hope you're okay if I take the video and publish that as well on YouTube.
I'm fine.
Okay.
I'm fine. I didn't have anything like dribbling out of my nose or
No, no. Not that I saw anyway.
Oh, good, good.
Maybe I did. I don't know, but
Uh,
if so, I'll find it
maybe
when
with a
I
4K
edit.
monitor or something. All right, Randy,
All right.
thanks very much.
Thanks, Vic. Have a good day.
Have a good Christmas.
You too.
Bye
Bye.
bye.